The morning Ida Dugan buried her husband, the sky over Clearwater Valley turned the color of a bruise, purple and swollen at the edges, as if the land itself had taken a blow it had not been expecting. She stood at the grave with her hands folded in front of her black dress and watched the clods of dark earth fall one by one onto the pine box that held what remained of Thomas Dugan, 29 years old, killed by a fever that came on a Tuesday and finished its work by Thursday. There had been no warning. There had been no time to prepare. There had only been the terrible swiftness of it, the way a man could be at the breakfast table one morning and gone before the week was out, leaving behind a wife, a failing homestead, and a silence so profound it felt like a living thing pressing against the walls of the house. The people of Clearwater came to pay their respects. There were perhaps 40 souls in the valley, scattered across the land in homesteads and small ranches, and most of them made the walk or the ride out to the Dugan property on that gray September morning of 1879. The women brought food wrapped in cloth. The men stood with their hats held against their chests and said the things men say when they do not know what else to say. Ida thanked each of them quietly. She did not cry. She had done her crying in private, in the hours between midnight and dawn, when the sound of it would not frighten her 7-year-old daughter Clara, who was staying with the Haverson family down the road and who had been told only that her papa was very sick and was sleeping somewhere peaceful now. After they were all gone, Ida stood alone at the fence line of her property and looked out at the 40 acres Thomas had staked 3 years ago when they came west from Ohio. The land was beautiful in the way that land can be beautiful when it does not care about your grief. The grass rolled in long amber waves to the south, and the aspens along the creek had just begun to turn gold, their leaves shaking in a wind that carried the smell of autumn and distance. Beyond the tree line, the valley opened up into a broad stretch of ranch country, and beyond that, the mountains rose dark and certain against the sky. She was 26 years old. She was alone. And she had absolutely no idea how she was going to hold on to this land through the coming winter without Thomas. It was Miriam Haverson who first mentioned Robert Chandler. Miriam came by 3 days after the funeral with a pot of soup and a practical nature that Ida had always appreciated. She was a stout, red-cheeked woman of about 50, married to Lars Haverson, who ran a respectable operation with cattle and a few good horses just south of the creek, and she had lived in the valley longer than nearly anyone except one person. "You need to talk to Robert Chandler," Miriam said, setting the soup on the iron stove and looking around the small kitchen with the assessing eyes of a woman who knew what a household in trouble looked like. "He knows this land better than anyone alive. He has been here since before the territory was organized. He knows what the winter does to a homestead this size, what it takes to get through, who to trust and who to stay clear of." "I don't want to be a burden," Ida said. Miriam turned and looked at her with something between patience and firmness. "Ida, the man has run the biggest cattle operation in this valley for 30 years. He's seen every kind of hardship this land can dish out, and he's helped more families than you can count. He is not going to see you as a burden. He is going to see you as a neighbor in need, which is exactly what you are. Now, he lives about 2 miles north of here at the end of the old Chandler Road. The house is stone, you can't miss it. Go talk to him." Ida meant to wait a few more days. She told herself she needed to gather her thoughts, to make a proper accounting of her situation before she went hat in hand to anyone. But then the barn roof began to leak that same night, and the morning after that she found one of her 2 milk cows had wandered through a gap in the fence and disappeared into the pasture beyond. And the morning after that, when she went to start a fire, she discovered the woodpile she'd thought would last well into October was already nearly gone. Thomas had been letting things slide in the weeks before the fever. She understood that now. He must have been feeling worse than he had let on. She saddled her mare on a Thursday morning, bundled herself against the cool air, and rode north along the valley road. The Chandler ranch announced itself gradually. First came the fence, A long, well-maintained line of cedar posts and wire that stretched as far as she could see in either direction, solid and square, and without a single gap. Then the cattle, big red Herefords moving slowly through the grass in the easy way of animals that are well fed and not afraid. Then the outbuildings, a barn that could have swallowed her entire homestead, a bunkhouse, a smithy, storage structures of various sizes, all of them weathered but tight and clearly maintained with care. And then the house itself, 2 stories of fitted stone with a deep porch running the length of the front, surrounded by cottonwood trees that must have been planted decades ago, their trunks as thick as a man's torso. Ida pulled her mare to a stop at the gate and sat for a moment, looking at all of it. A man came around the corner of the barn with a bucket in each hand. He was tall, still broad through the shoulders despite his age, with white hair showing beneath a battered hat that had seen at least 20 years of weather. He moved with the particular economy of motion that very capable people develop over long lifetimes of physical work, nothing wasted, every step placed with quiet certainty. He was perhaps 60 years old, perhaps a few years past that, with a face deeply lined by sun and wind and time, and eyes that were startlingly clear and direct beneath the brim of his hat. He set the buckets down when he saw her and walked to the gate. "Mrs. Dugan," he said. He had a low voice, unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need to raise itself to be heard. "I'm Robert Chandler. I came to the funeral, though I expect you met so many people that day it's hard to keep track. I'm sorry about Thomas." He seemed like a decent man. "He was," Ida said. "Thank you." There was a brief, comfortable silence, the kind that occurs between people who understand that some things don't need to be filled in. "Miriam Haverson said I should come talk to you," Ida said, "about the winter, about what I need to do to hold on to my property." Robert Chandler looked at her for a moment with those clear eyes, and then he opened the gate. "Come inside," he said. "I'll put the coffee on." The interior of the stone house was plain and orderly and unexpectedly comfortable. There were bookshelves along one wall of the main room, filled with actual books, a detail that surprised Ida. There were a Navajo blanket over the back of a sturdy chair, a stone fireplace large enough to stand in, a table of dark wood worn smooth by decades of use. The whole place had the feeling of a life that had been lived here, not just spent. Robert Chandler made coffee with the same efficiency he seemed to bring to everything and set a cup in front of her and sat down across the table. He listened while she talked. She had prepared what she was going to say, had practiced it in her head on the ride over, but once she started talking it came out less organized than she'd planned, more honest, the real shape of her situation emerging as she spoke. The leaking roof. The missing cow, which she'd eventually found tangled in the brush by the creek. The state of the woodpile. The fact that she had $40 left to her name and a daughter to feed through what the old-timers all said was going to be a hard winter. She didn't know anything about cattle. Thomas had been planning to expand into cattle next spring. She had chickens and the 2 milk cows and a kitchen garden that was about finished for the season and a wagon that needed a new axle. She was a decent rider and a hard worker, and she was not going to leave. She said that very clearly. She was not going to be driven off her land. Robert Chandler listened to all of it without interrupting once. When she finished, he turned his coffee cup slowly in both hands and was quiet for a moment. "The roof I can fix," he said. "I'll send a man over tomorrow. The woodpile is the more urgent problem. There's a stand of deadfall on the eastern boundary of my property that I've been meaning to clear for 2 seasons. You can have all of it if you'll help stack it. It'll take a week of good work, but it'll see you through March easily." He went on. He knew a man in town who was selling a reliable milk cow at a fair price. He could lend her 2 of his hands to help winterize the barn before the cold set in properly. If she was willing to run a few of his cattle on her south pasture, he would pay her a modest monthly sum for the grass rights, which would give her a small but steady income through the season. He had maps of the valley that he could share with her, showing the spring water sources so she'd know where to find water if the creek froze solid. He spoke about all of this in the same quiet, unhurried way he'd said hello, as if solving the problems of a struggling neighbor was a perfectly ordinary way to spend a morning, which Ida began to suspect it perhaps was for him. "Why would you do all of this?" she asked when he'd finished. She didn't mean it as a challenge. She genuinely wanted to understand. He looked at her with a small flicker of something in his eyes that might have been amusement or might have been something older and more complicated. "Because that's what you do," he said simply. "This valley is a community. We don't let people fail if we can help it. And besides," he added, looking down at his coffee cup, "I remember what it was like to be new to this land and not know what you didn't know. Someone helped me once, long time ago. It was the only reason I made it." She wanted to ask who had helped him, and when, but something in the way he said it, quietly, without elaborating, made her feel that the story was not for this first meeting. She rode home that afternoon feeling lighter than she had in 2 weeks. Robert Chandler's man came the next morning to patch the roof. His name was Pete Acaffer, a quiet Texan of about 40 with skilled hands and an unhurried manner, and he had the leak fixed by noon. 2 days after that, Robert Chandler himself arrived with a wagon and 2 more hands, and they began working on the stand of deadfall along the eastern fence line. Ida worked alongside them, hauling and stacking, learning the rhythm of it, and by the end of the first day she had worked hard enough that she ached in every muscle but felt better than she had since Thomas died. Robert Chandler did not treat her like a woman who needed protecting. He showed her what needed doing and let her do it, and when she did it well, which was most of the time because Ida Dugan had never shied away from hard work, he simply moved on to the next thing without comment. She found she liked that enormously. On the 3rd day of the wood cutting, they stopped at midday by the creek to eat. The hands had gone back to the ranch to check on a lame horse, and it was just the 2 of them sitting on a fallen log with the creek running clear and cold a few feet away, and the aspens golden all around them. "How long have you been in this valley?" Ida asked. "Came here in 1848, he said. 31 years. She did the arithmetic without meaning to. He had come here before the Civil War, before Nebraska became a territory, before most of the people in this valley were born. "You were young," she said. 24, he said. "Felt old at the time." "Were you alone?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the creek. "I came with my wife," he said. "Eleanor. We had a daughter, too, small thing, 3 years old when we came out." The past tense of it was clear in the way he said the names, the particular care a person takes when handling something fragile. "The daughter's name was Rose," he said. "She grew up here on this land. Married a good man named Coleman Vance about 15 years ago. They're up in Colorado now in the mountains, have 4 children. She comes back when she can, which isn't often enough." He said this without bitterness. "Eleanor passed in 1871, 8 years ago." "I'm sorry," Ida said. He nodded, acknowledging it without dwelling on it. "Were you happy?" Ida asked, and then immediately felt she'd overstepped. "I'm sorry, that's too personal a question." "No," he said, "it's not." He picked up a small flat stone and turned it over in his hand. "We were very happy, not always easy, mind you. This land has a way of testing people, but happy, yes. Do you miss her?" The question surprised him, she could tell. He looked at her directly for the first time in the conversation, and his expression was not offended, only thoughtful, as if he was genuinely considering an answer rather than reaching for a polite one. "Every day," he said, "but not in a way that makes the days unbearable, more in a way that reminds me what the days are worth." Ida thought about that for a long moment, turning it over in her mind the way he'd turned the stone. "Can I ask you something strange?" She said. "I expect you can," he said. "What does love feel like? Real love, I mean, the kind that lasts." She paused, aware of how it sounded. "Thomas and I, we cared for each other. Genuinely. But we were young when we married, and sometimes I wondered if what we had was real love or just, I don't know, companionship and habit. I feel terrible saying that, especially now. But I find myself wondering about it, and I don't have anyone I can ask." Robert Chandler was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Ida began to think she had truly said something wrong. Then he stood up from the log and turned to face the open meadow to the west of the creek, and he pointed. Two of his horses had gotten through the fence somewhere and wandered into the meadow, a thing that would have meant an extra hour's work rounding them up. That was not what he was pointing at. He was pointing at the way one of the horses, a big bay mare, had her nose resting gently on the neck of the other horse, a gray gelding who was standing perfectly still, receiving that contact with a kind of quiet satisfaction that was unmistakable even from a distance. They had chosen to be close. They were not required to stand that way. They simply wanted to. Like that, Robert Chandler said. Ida looked at the two horses for a long time. "You choose it," she said slowly, understanding arriving the way good understandings arrive, not all at once but in layers. "Even when you don't have to. Every morning," he said quietly. "You choose it every morning. And eventually the choosing becomes so natural you don't notice you're doing it anymore. It just becomes who you are." He turned back from the meadow and their eyes met, and something happened between them that neither of them acknowledged. Something quiet and certain as the turning of the season, that settled into the air between them and did not go away. They went back to cutting wood. The winter came hard in late October, as the old-timers had predicted, rolling down from the mountains in great gray walls of cloud and wind. Ida had her woodpile and her winterized barn, and Pete Acaffer had helped her repair the fence lines, and Robert Chandler's cattle were grazing her south pasture, which meant a small, steady trickle of money to keep the household alive. Clara came home from the Haversons, where she'd been staying while Ida got herself organized, and the house was warmer for her presence. She was a serious child with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and she took to the daily rhythms of the homestead with a quiet competence that sometimes broke Ida's heart with its beauty. Robert Chandler came by twice a week to check on the cattle and to handle whatever had gone wrong since his last visit, and there was usually something: a stuck gate, a sick chicken, ice on the water trough, the small constant difficulties of winter on the frontier. He always stayed for coffee and sometimes for supper, and Ida came to look forward to those evenings with a feeling that she recognized but did not yet name. He was so different from Thomas. Thomas had been warm and easy and quick to laugh, a man you liked immediately. Robert Chandler was none of those things exactly, but he was something else, something that took longer to see and was perhaps harder to find. He was the most genuinely capable person Ida had ever encountered. He knew how to do everything, not in a way that showed off, but in a way that was simply useful, quietly and thoroughly useful in every situation. He knew how to mend a harness and set a broken fence post and read the weather 3 days out and talk to a frightened animal and listen to a person who was struggling without making them feel pitied. And he was funny, in a dry, understated way that crept up on you. He would say something and she would be several seconds into thinking about something else before she realized it had been a joke, and by the time she laughed he had already moved on to the next thing, and she would catch the faintest possible suggestion of satisfaction at the corner of his mouth. Clara liked him immediately. Children and animals, Ida had observed, tended to have good instincts about people. "Mr. Chandler," Clara said one evening in November, sitting across the table from him with her bowl of soup and her disconcerting directness, "do you have any children?" "A daughter," he said. "Grown up, lives far away." "Do you miss her?" "Yes," he said. "Does she miss you?" "I hope so," he said, and smiled at her, and Clara nodded seriously as if this were the correct answer. After Clara was in bed, Ida and Robert sat by the fire, which was something that had been happening more and more, the conversation stretching into the evening without either of them having arranged for it. "She's a remarkable child," he said. "She's the best part of me," Ida said, "and the best part of Thomas. I'm grateful every day that he left me that much." He looked at her steadily across the firelight. "You're doing well, Ida." She had noticed some weeks ago that he had stopped saying Mrs. Dugan. She had not mentioned it. She had simply felt the shift and filed it away. "Some days," she said honestly. "Other days I'm held together with stubbornness and pride." "Those are respectable materials," he said. She laughed. He looked surprised by himself, by the lightness of the thing he'd said, and then he smiled fully, a rare enough occurrence that it still startled her when it happened. It changed his whole face. The winter deepened. The valley disappeared under snow in December and stayed buried through January. The cold was extraordinary, the kind of cold that made the air taste of metal and turned the creek to a solid green-gray surface under the ice. Ida's world contracted to the house and the barn and the path between them, and she found herself not minding as much as she might have expected. Robert Chandler came even in the worst weather. She understood, without having been told directly, that he kept a closer eye on her operation than he did on any other neighbors, that he routed his daily rounds through her property more than was strictly necessary for the cattle check. She was not sure how she felt about needing that. She was sure how she felt about him. It was something she turned over carefully in her mind during the long winter evenings after Clara was asleep, sitting by the fire with her mending or her journal. She was not the kind of woman who moved quickly to conclusions. She had learned from Thomas's death, if nothing else, that the timeline of a life could be startlingly short, that the time you thought you had to figure things out was not guaranteed. But she was also aware of what she did not know. She did not know if what she felt was genuine or if it was gratitude and dependence dressed up as something deeper. She did not know what he felt. If he felt anything other than the neighborly responsibility he seemed to extend to everyone in the valley with equal generosity. She did not know how the community would regard a widow who had barely finished her mourning year before beginning to feel things for another man. She was, in short, in a state of wanting something she had not yet let herself want, and the restraint was becoming more effortful with each passing week. The event that broke the restraint open happened on a Sunday afternoon in late January. She had been in town in Clearwater, the small collection of buildings that served the valley, getting supplies and picking up her mail. The mail included a letter from Thomas's brother in Ohio, a man named Gerald Dugan who had never much liked Ida. The letter was brief, and its meaning was clear. Gerald had consulted a lawyer. He believed he had a claim to the Clearwater property through some element of inheritance law that Ida did not fully understand, and he intended to pursue it. He was not asking. He was informing. Ida read the letter twice standing on the wooden walkway in front of the general store, with the cold pressing through her coat, and felt something go hot and then very cold inside her. She rode home in a state that was somewhere between fury and fear. She had been hanging on to this land by her fingernails through the worst winter in recent memory. She had done everything right. She had asked for help and worked herself to exhaustion and kept her daughter fed and warm and not given an inch to despair. And now a man who had visited Thomas exactly twice in their entire married life was going to use a lawyer to take it from her. She arrived home to find Robert Chandler at her barn, dealing with a frozen water line, a problem he had apparently noticed in passing and simply started fixing without being asked. He looked up when she rode in and immediately saw that something was wrong. "What happened?" he said. She handed him the letter. He read it standing in the snow with his hat pushed back and his expression doing something complicated and controlled. "Gerald Dugan is a problem," he said finally. "You know of him." Thomas mentioned him once, said they weren't close. He looked at the letter again. "This lawyer he's hired is named Stroud. He operates out of Wichita. He's got a reputation for finding angles in property disputes, the kind that are technically legal and morally indefensible." The precision of the information, the way he'd had it ready, told her he knew more about the workings of the territory than she did, which of course he did. "Can he take my land?" Ida asked. "Not without a fight," Robert Chandler said quietly, and the way he said it made it sound less like an answer and more like a promise. "And not as long as I have anything to say about it. There's a lawyer in Clearwater, man named Fletcher, who knows land law as well as anyone in the territory. I'll ride over tomorrow and talk to him." "Robert," she said, This is my problem. He looked at her with those clear, steady eyes. I know it is, he said. I'd like to help anyway. She stood in the snow with the cold all around her and the letter folded in her hand and looked at him for a long moment, and something she had been holding at arm's length stepped fully into the room of her heart and sat down. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, he said. Thank me when Stroud has gone back to Wichita with his tail between his legs. He went back to the water line. She went inside to put the coffee on and to let herself feel, privately, in the kitchen, the shape of what she was beginning to understand. Robert rode to see Fletcher the next morning. Fletcher turned out to be a small, energetic man of about 50 with wire-rimmed glasses and the organized, insistent quality of someone who genuinely loved the practice of law. He read Gerald Dugan's letter, and then read it again, and then took off his glasses and polished them in a way that suggested he was thinking rapidly. The claim is based on a provision in the inheritance of personal property that existed in Ohio law before the Dugans relocated, Fletcher said. It would have no standing here if Mrs. Dugan can establish continuous residence and active use of the land, which from what you've described she clearly can. What Stroud is banking on is that she doesn't know that or can't afford to fight it. She can afford to fight it, Robert said. Fletcher looked at him over his glasses. She will be able to, Robert said. Fletcher drew up a document that established Ida's rights to the property under Nebraska territorial law, gathering affidavits from neighbors and county records, and establishing a clear line of continuous use and residence that Gerald Dugan's Ohio lawyer was going to have a very hard time arguing around. It took 3 weeks and cost money that Robert paid out of his own pocket without telling Ida directly, routing it through Fletcher as a retainer that he described to her simply as a local legal service with a standard community rate. She knew, eventually. She was not a woman who missed things. The letter back to Gerald Dugan's lawyer was sent in the first week of February. It laid out, in Fletcher's precise and unadorned legal language, exactly why the claim had no merit under the applicable law and what would happen to Gerald Dugan's reputation and finances if he chose to pursue it through the courts anyway. Gerald Dugan's lawyer advised his client not to pursue it. Ida did not hear this directly until March, when the first real thaw came, and the world began to emerge from under the snow with the tentative optimism of something that has survived a long ordeal. Fletcher sent her a note, short and professional, informing her that the matter had been resolved in her favor. She read it at the kitchen table and felt a relief so large it left her momentarily unable to speak. Clara was at the table doing her lessons. She looked up. "Is it good news, Mama?" "Yes," Ida said. "The best kind, the kind where nothing bad happened after all." Clara considered this. "Mr. Chandler will be happy," she said, and went back to her sums. Ida sat for a long moment looking at her daughter's bent head. Then she put on her coat and rode north to the stone house. Robert was in the corral working with a young horse that was testing everyone's patience, a big chestnut colt with an opinion about everything. He saw Ida ride up and handed the lead rope to one of his hands without taking his eyes off her, reading her expression the way he'd learned to read the weather, understanding before she opened her mouth. She came through the gate and stopped a few feet from him and held up Fletcher's note. "He's not coming," she said. Something in Robert's face did something she had never quite seen it do before, a kind of release, as if a tension he'd been carrying for weeks had finally been able to put itself down. "Good," he said. "You paid Fletcher," she said. He did not look away. "Yes, you didn't tell me." "No, Robert." She said his name not as a reproach but as a question, a whole question, the real one. He took the note from her hand gently and looked at it and handed it back. "You were going to keep your land, Ida, one way or another. I was just making sure the path was clear." "Why?" she said. The question hung between them in the cold March air, which had the smell of thaw in it, of mud and running water beginning again under the ice, of things resuming. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked away to the south toward her land. "You know why," he said quietly. She did know. She had known for weeks, Perhaps since November, perhaps since the day by the creek when he had pointed across the meadow at two horses standing close together of their own free choosing. "I'm not sure how to do this," she said. "I was married, I know what that is, but this is different and I don't want to make a mistake." "Neither do I," he said. "I'm 61 years old. I've made most of my mistakes already and I have a clear accounting of what they cost. I'm not interested in making new ones." He paused. "But I'm also not interested in pretending this isn't what it is." She looked at him standing there in the cold light of early spring, tall and sure and more known to her now than she would have thought possible 5 months ago. This man who had fixed her roof and cut her firewood and defended her land and sat by her fire on winter evenings, and never once, not once, made her feel like less than exactly herself. "I'm not either," she said. He reached out and took her hand, just that, just her hand in his, and stood holding it in the March cold while the chestnut colt snorted behind them, and somewhere a crow called across the brightening sky. Spring came in slowly, the way it does in that country, not arriving all at once but advancing and retreating, teasing, a warm week followed by a cold snap, green appearing in the lowlands while the high pastures were still white. But it came. The creek ran free and fast with snowmelt. The cattle came down from the winter pastures looking thin but alive. The kitchen garden was ready to plant again. Ida and Robert spent a great deal of that spring in each other's company, some of it practical, some of it not. He took her and Clara on a ride up into the high country one Saturday when the aspens were just beginning to bud, following trails he knew from 3 decades of riding this land, showing them the hidden springs and the meadow where the elk came in summer, and the ridge line from which, on a clear day, you could see the whole sweep of the valley below, the creek thread of silver through the green, the homestead small and purposeful in the distance. Clara rode behind her mother on the mare and asked questions about everything with an energy that made Robert laugh more than Ida had ever heard him laugh. "Why are those rocks red?" Clara demanded. "Iron in the stone," he said. "Why does iron make things red?" "That's a question for a chemist," he said, "or possibly a philosopher." "What's a philosopher?" "Someone who asks why about everything and doesn't get tired." Clara thought about this. "I'm a philosopher," she said. "You absolutely are," he agreed. Ida watched him with her daughter and felt something settle in her chest, something permanent and sure. He was good with Clara. Not in the easy, playful way some adults were with children, the way that came from not spending much time with them, but in the considered, respectful way of someone who took a child's inner life seriously, who answered questions honestly and listened when Clara talked and did not condescend to her in any way. Clara, for her part, had fully decided the matter. She had assigned Robert Chandler a place in her world that had nothing to do with her father's absence, and everything to do with who Robert himself was. In April, he asked Ida to ride out with him and look at a section of the eastern pasture that he wanted her opinion on regarding a possible property line adjustment that would benefit her grazing access. It was a completely legitimate practical matter, and they both knew it, and they also both knew that the discussion of the property line lasted about 20 minutes and they remained out in the pasture for 2 hours. They sat on a flat rock above the creek and watched the water go by, and talked the way people talk when they are becoming each other's primary language, easily, honestly, circling back to old subjects and finding new things in them. He told her about coming west in 1848, 18 years old and terrified and determined not to show it, following a wagon train out of Missouri with a leaner who was 19 and more confident than he was, and had been the one to propose the idea in the first place. Leaner had been that kind of woman, sure and forward-moving, the kind of woman who decided a thing and did it. "She sounds wonderful," Ida said. "She was," he said simply. "Different from you." The comparison arrived without judgment in either direction. Ida understood it was not a ranking. "You're more cautious than she was," he said, looking at the water. "But when you decide something, you hold to it absolutely. I've seen that. The way you held on this winter, you would not let go." "I had Clara," she said. "You had you," he said. She turned to look at him. The spring light was warm on his face. The lines of it were the lines of a life fully lived, of decisions made and weather endured and grief absorbed and seasons watched come and go from this same land for 30 years. She found him beautiful in the way that things that have lasted are beautiful, in the way of the old cottonwood trees in his yard or the mountains that had been standing there since before any of them arrived. "Robert," she said. "Yes, I'd like you to kiss me." The directness of it surprised him. She could see it in the fraction of a second before he recovered. Then he smiled fully, the rare full smile. "All right," he said. He kissed her the way she would have expected him to do everything, with complete attention and without hurry, and the world was very quiet around them, only the creek and the wind in the new leaves and somewhere high up, a meadowlark. They rode home in the late afternoon with the valley below them turning gold in the low sun, and neither of them said much, and neither of them needed to. Word travels in a small valley. It travels faster than the creek and more persistently than the wind. By May, it was generally known in Clearwater that Robert Chandler and Ida Dugan were courting, and the opinion on the matter was mostly positive. Robert had been a fixture of the valley for so long that his business was everyone's business to some degree, and the consensus, delivered through various conduits including Miriam Haverson, was that it was about time Robert had someone, and that Ida Dugan was an admirable woman who had handled the winter with more grace than most, and deserved something good. There was one dissenting voice, and its name was Clarence Dobb. Clarence Dobb ran a mid-sized cattle operation east of the creek, and had been, Ida gathered over time, a persistent nuisance in Robert's professional life for years. He believed he'd been cheated in a cattle deal by Robert some years back, a belief Robert calmly maintained was a misunderstanding, but which Dobb had elevated to something of a personal grievance. He was a man in his mid-40s, broad and reddish, who spoke loudly in the company of other men and slightly less loudly in Robert's direct presence, and who expressed his opinion about Robert and Ida's courtship in terms that were insulting to both of them, and that made the rounds of the valley in about a week. Robert was, to Ida's mild frustration, entirely undisturbed by this. "He's been saying things about me for 6 years," Robert said, on the porch of the stone house on a warm May evening. "The number of people who have stopped listening to him about the cattle deal is more than the number who started." "He said things about me that were not appropriate," Ida said. "I know," Robert said, in a tone that was quieter and which meant something slightly different. "Robert, I'm not going to let it pass completely," he said. "But I'm also not going to handle it in a way that gives him more to talk about. I'll speak to him directly as I have before. That's the end of it." He went to see Dobb the next morning. Whatever was said between them, Ida did not ask, and Robert did not volunteer completely, except to say that the conversation had been frank, and that he did not anticipate further problems. From what she heard later through the Valley's efficient information network, Robert had told Dobb in a private and level-voiced exchange that certain kinds of talk had consequences, and that he personally would ensure those consequences were applied if the talk continued. This delivered in the particular way Robert Chandler delivered things, without volume but with the absolute certainty of a man who did exactly what he said, appeared to have been entirely effective. Clarence Dobb did not say anything further about either of them. June came warm and full of the scent of sage and wildflowers. Ida's kitchen garden was lush, and her south pasture was a deep green from the wet spring. Clara had finished her school lessons for the season and spent her days between the homestead and the Haverson farm, where she'd formed a strong friendship with the youngest Haverson girl, a child named Petra who was her same age and her opposite temperament. Where Clara was serious and measured, Petra was exuberant and theatrical, and together they were capable of extraordinary mischief. On a Saturday afternoon in the middle of June, Robert arrived at Ida's homestead with 2 horses saddled and a look of particular intention on his face. "Where are we going?" she asked. "The East Meadow," he said. "Why?" "You'll see." The East Meadow was the one she could see from the window of her house, the long golden field that stretched to the tree line, the one she had looked out at every morning and evening for nearly a year. It was beautiful in all weather and in all light, but in June it was something specific and deliberate. The grass long and full and moving in long soft waves, the wildflowers scattered through it in blues and golds, and the occasional startling red of Indian paintbrush, the aspen trees along the far edge trembling green and silver. They tied the horses at the fence and walked out into the middle of it, which felt like walking into the middle of something living. Robert stopped and turned to face her, and she stopped too, a few feet away, the grass reaching to their knees and the sky enormous and blue above them. "I've been thinking about how to do this properly," he said. She understood instantly, and something in her chest went very still. "I'm not a young man," he said, with the directness she'd come to expect from him. "I know that. I'm 35 years older than you, Ida, and that's not a small thing, and I would be dishonest with you if I didn't say clearly that I think about it. I don't know how many good years I have. I think I have a fair number. I come from long-lived stock and I take care of myself, but I don't know." "Robert," she said. "Let me finish," he said, "because I've been composing this for about 6 weeks, and if I don't say it now, I'll lose the thread." She pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. "I have lived a long life," he said. "A good one. I built this ranch with my own hands, and I raised a daughter I'm proud of, and I loved a woman who deserved the love I had to give, and I have watched this valley for 30 years and seen it become something. And I thought, after a leaner, that was the life. That was the whole of it, and what came after was just the last portion, the finishing out. And then you rode up to my gate with your back straight, and your chin up in that way you have, looking like you'd fight the entire winter with your bare hands if necessary, and I was 31 years older than the feeling I immediately started having about you." The sun was warm on her face. The grass moved around them. "I love you," he said. "I would very much like to marry you if you'll have me. I'll be honest about my age and my limitations, and I'll try not to die before I've been useful to you as long as possible. I'll be a good husband to you and a good presence in Clara's life. I cannot replace her father, and I would not try. But I can be something else to her if she'll let me, something that's its own thing and good for what it is. And the ranch and the property are all in order, and I've already spoken to Fletcher about the appropriate arrangements, so that you and Clara are fully protected regardless of what the future holds. I'm not asking you to take a risk without having thought through what it means for you." She stared at him. "You spoke to Fletcher," she said. "Last month," he said. "I wanted to have it clear before I asked." She thought about what he had just said, the whole shape of it, the thoroughness of it, the way even his proposal had been organized to protect her from risk, and she felt something that was not precisely amusement and not precisely weeping, but was very close to both. "Robert Chandler," she said. "Yes. You are the most practical man I have ever met." "I'm aware of that," he said, with the flicker of self-knowledge that she loved in him. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again, clearly. "I will marry you. I love you. I have loved you since at least November, possibly since October. I'm still working out the exact date, and the age difference does not frighten me because you are more present and more alive and more genuinely here than anyone I have ever known." He crossed the space between them and took her face in both his hands, very gently, the way he handled things he valued, and kissed her in the east meadow with the summer grass all around them and the sky overhead and the whole long breathing valley spread out to every side. They were married in August. The ceremony was simple, held outside on the grounds of the stone house under the cottonwood trees, with the Haverson family and Pete Ockafer, and a dozen other neighbors and Fletcher and his wife, and the valley's minister who came up from the town, dressed in his Sunday best, and sweating gently in the August heat. Clara stood beside her mother in a new dress that Miriam Haverson had helped Ida sew, a blue dress with small white buttons, and she was solemn and beautiful and completely composed, until the moment the minister said the final words and Robert produced a simple gold ring and put it on Ida's finger, at which point Clara quietly took Robert's hand and held it, and Robert looked down at her, and something moved through his face that was too private for the assembled company. That belonged to the three of them. The party afterward ran until dark and past it, with Haverson's fiddle and the neighbor's guitar and dancing in the yard and enough food to last a week and stars appearing slowly one by one above the cottonwoods as the evening deepened. Miriam found Ida at some point in the middle of the evening and pulled her aside with the conspiratorial energy she brought to everything. "Well," she said. "Well, what?" Ida said. "I was right," Miriam said. "I told you to go talk to him." Ida laughed. "You told me he knew about the valley." "I told you exactly what you needed to know," Miriam said, satisfied, and went back to the dancing. After the guests had gone and Clara was asleep, Ida stood on the stone porch in the dark with the lantern burning low behind her and looked out at the east meadow, which was silver and black in the moonlight, the grass moving softly, the aspens at the far edge a dark line against the sky. Robert came and stood beside her, and she leaned into him and he put his arm around her. "We should discuss the property arrangements," she said. "Tomorrow. I want to understand exactly what Fletcher set up." "Tomorrow," he agreed, "and I want to keep my homestead active, not sold. I want Clara to have it when she's old enough." "I already thought the same thing," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I love you." They stood for a while in the quiet. "Are you happy?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, the way he would want her to, not the reflexive yes but the real answer. "I am," she said, "very, also a little terrified." "Of what?" "Of how much I would lose if I lost this." He tightened his arm around her. "I know," he said quietly. "Is that what love feels like?" she said. "The terrifying part included." She felt him nod against her hair. "The terrifying part is just the price of the rest of it," he said. "I've decided it's worth it." "Me too," she said. They went inside. The first year of their marriage had the quality that good first years of marriages sometimes have, the feeling of two lives finding their combined shape, which involves some adjustment and some surprise discovery, and a great deal of the daily, particular, unglamorous business of living together, which is where people find out who they actually are to each other. Ida moved to the stone house in the fall, bringing Clara and her furniture and her garden seeds and her determination. She kept the homestead as a working property with Pete Ockhaffer managing it, and a portion of the cattle grazing there through the season, and the income from it she placed in an account for Clara's future. The stone house absorbed them. It was large enough that they each had room and small enough that they were never far from each other, and this seemed to be exactly the right balance. Ida reorganized the kitchen, which had been maintained by Robert on the principle of functionality without beauty, and planted a proper kitchen garden on the south side of the house where it got the best sun, and found 3 apple trees that had been growing wild in the back lot that no one had been harvesting, and made enough apple butter in September to last them through March. Clara adjusted to the new household with the adaptability of a child who has already navigated harder changes, and her relationship with Robert grew steadily into something that had its own name, that was not replacement of anything but was its own genuine thing. He taught her to ride properly, not just to sit on a horse but to ride, to understand what the animal was doing and why. He taught her to read the weather, pointing out the cloud formations and the wind directions and what they meant. He let her help in the barn, and answered her questions with the same patience and completeness he brought to everything. Once Ida heard him telling Clara about Nebraska becoming a state in 1867, and the history of the territory before that, how the land had been taken from the Sioux and the Pawnee, the treaties made and broken, the injustice of it which had been enormous and was still unresolved. He did not soften it or complicate it away. He told her what had happened, what had been done, and that it was wrong, and that history being what it was she needed to understand it. Clara had asked, "Is it still wrong even if no one fixes it?" And Robert had said, "Yes, that's the hardest kind of wrong to sit with." Ida had stood in the hallway and felt her heart do something large and private. The second winter was easier than the first, because they faced it together. There is a particular warmth in a house where two people who have chosen each other are present, something that has nothing to do with the fire and the hearth, and the stone house had it in full measure. Robert's daughter Rose came for Christmas. She arrived with her husband Coleman Vance, a quiet, capable man with a ready laugh, and their 4 children, ranging in age from 3 to 12. And the house that had been so quiet suddenly had the noise and chaos of a family reunion that was also a first meeting. Ida and Clara meeting Rose for the first time, everyone sizing everyone up with the careful attention people bring to the question of whether this is going to be all right. It was better than all right. Rose was Aline's daughter in her sure, forward-moving nature, and she was Robert's daughter in her careful honesty. And she took one long look at Ida and the way Robert was in a room with Ida and seemed to settle the matter for herself within the first few minutes. "He's different," she said to Ida privately when they were washing dishes after the first dinner and the men were in the main room with the children. "In a good way. He was happy before, or he managed to be, but this is different. This is him actually looking forward. He's been very good to me," Ida said. "He's very good to everyone," Rose said, with the mild exasperation of a daughter who has watched her father give himself to the world for years. The question was whether anyone would be good back to him in the particular way he needed. "I think you are." Ida considered this. "I hope so," she said. "I know so," Rose said with finality. "Merry Christmas, Ida. I'm glad he found you." Clara and the Vance children reached an immediate and enthusiastic alliance that lasted the entire visit and resulted in 2 snowball battles. A sledding incident involving the big hill behind the barn that Robert watched with his hat in his hand and chose not to intervene in, and a dramatic performance on Christmas Eve of a play that Clara had written and the Vance children had agreed to perform, which concerned a princess and a dragon and featured dialogue that Ida thought showed a surprising aptitude for the theatrical. Rose and Coleman and the children left 2 days after Christmas, heading back north. The house returned to its quieter self, but it kept some of the warmth from the visit, a lingering good feeling. Spring of 1881 came, and with it a piece of news that arrived in stages, first as a wondering, then as a certainty, which Ida delivered to Robert one Sunday morning while he was drinking his coffee on the porch and watching the horses in the south paddock. She came out and stood beside him, and he looked up at her, reading her face in that way he always did, and before she said anything he had already begun to understand. "We're going to have a child," she said. The quietness that came over his face was total. Then it broke open into something she had not seen there before, something almost unguarded. "Ida," he said. "I know," she said. "I was surprised too, though I suppose I shouldn't have been." He stood up slowly and held her face in his hands and looked at her for a long moment with those clear eyes that now held something that she thought might have been swimming at the edges. "Are you all right?" he said. "Perfectly," she said. "A little tired. Miriam says that's normal." "Miriam knows. I told her this morning. She says it's wonderful and that she'll help with the birth when the time comes. She was a midwife before she married Lars. I didn't know that." He shook his head slowly. "Miriam Haverson," he said. "She knows everything before anyone else. She told me to talk to you," Ida said. "About the land, back at the beginning. I'm fairly sure we owe her everything." He laughed fully and pulled her close. The pregnancy was easy overall, as first pregnancies in good health go, with the expected difficulties of the earlier months, and then the long expanding middle portion when everything was fine but very large. And Robert treated Ida with a combination of practical concern and total refusal to be overprotective that she deeply appreciated. He did not stop her from doing things she was capable of doing. He watched quietly and made sure the things that would have been harder were handled. He hired an additional hand through the summer so the heavy work was covered. He made sure she had what she needed without making her feel she needed to be managed. Clara was fascinated and asked detailed medical questions that taxed even Miriam's comprehensive knowledge. She had decided she was going to be a doctor, a resolution arrived at with complete seriousness, and she had already started a notebook of observations. "There are very few lady doctors," Robert told her, not as a discouragement but factually. There are some, Clara said. Elizabeth Blackwell, she's a doctor. She went to school in New York. I read about her in a book. He looked at her over the top of his coffee cup. You're right, I stand corrected. I know, she said serenely. He looked at Ida. Ida kept her face neutral. The child arrived in November at the end of a day that had been cold and clear, the kind of day when the sky is very blue and the air smells like winter waiting politely outside the door. Miriam was there and her eldest daughter, and Robert was in the house, not in the room because it was not the custom of the time, but close, in the main room, very still in his chair by the fire. The child was a boy. He was born strong and loud, with Robert's coloring, dark hair that stood up improbably from his scalp, and he announced himself to the world with a vigor that made Miriam laugh. Robert was permitted into the room shortly after, and stood looking at the child in Ida's arms with an expression that Ida would remember for the rest of her life. 63 years old, and looking at his son with the utter freshness of a man for whom something entirely new had just happened. "Hello," he said to the baby, quietly, as if introductions were called for. Clara came in from where she'd been waiting and stood on her toes to see. "He's very red," she said. "They are at first," Miriam said. "What are you going to call him?" Clara asked. Ida looked at Robert. They had discussed names. They had a short list. "Thomas," Ida said. "Thomas Robert Chandler." Robert looked at her, and the warmth in his eyes was everything. "Good," he said softly. The winter that year was gentler than either of the previous two, as if the land understood that there was something new in the stone house that required a period of settling in. Thomas Robert Chandler was a healthy baby and a moderately reasonable one, in that he slept more than he did not, and was content as long as the basic provisions of his existence were met. He had his father's disposition already, the quality of watchfulness, the sense of a person organizing themselves carefully before acting. Robert was not, it became clear, a man who made any distinction between his son and other things he'd committed himself to. He was fully present to the baby in the same complete, unhurried way he was fully present to everything. He got up in the night when the baby cried so that Ida could sleep. He learned to hold a very small person with the same sure competence he brought to large tasks. When Thomas was 4 months old, Robert took him outside for the first time and stood on the porch in the late winter sun and held him up so he could see the east meadow, the long grass still pale and dead under the gray sky, waiting for spring. "This will be yours one day," Robert said to his son, very quietly, more to himself than to the baby who could not understand. "All of it. But first it has to be the valleys, and the valleys first. That's the order of things." Ida stood in the doorway watching them and did not say a word. Spring of 1882 came, and the east meadow turned green again, and the aspens leafed out, and the cattle moved to the summer pastures, and life resumed its cycles. Clara was 9, finishing her lessons with a determination that had not wavered, still planning to be a doctor with the same complete certainty she brought to all her serious intentions. She had been corresponding, with Ida's help, with a school in Omaha that offered advanced education for young women, and there was a plan forming for when she was old enough, a plan that Robert had helped structure and that Miriam had enthusiastically endorsed, and that Ida held in her heart with the particular complicated love of a mother watching her child begin to exist beyond the borders of what the mother alone can provide. One evening in May, Ida and Robert sat on the stone porch in the last of the light while Thomas slept inside, and the east meadow was gold and blue with the evening flowers, and the wind moved through the grass in long, slow waves. She thought about the day she had ridden up to this gate, more than 2.5 years ago now, a widow with $40 and a leaking roof, and a determination that was stronger than her knowledge of what she was up against. She thought about the cup of coffee he'd put in front of her, and the way he'd listened. She thought about the day by the creek in the aspens, the 2 horses in the meadow, the clear, quiet answer he'd given to the question she'd been afraid was too personal to ask. She thought about the east meadow on the day he'd proposed, the grass to their knees and the sky above them, and the long, complete, organized, honest proposal from a man who had already spoken to a lawyer, because he wanted to be sure she was protected regardless of what happened, who had thought of her before he thought of himself, who had chosen to choose her the way he described love, deliberately, every morning, until it became who he was. She reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of his chair. He turned his palm up and held her hand. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The day you pointed across the meadow," she said. "The horses." He was quiet for a moment. "I think about that day often," he said. "What do you think about it?" "That I knew," he said simply. "Before I knew, but I knew." "So did I," she said. "I just needed a little longer to admit it." The evening deepened. Thomas made a brief sound from inside the house and then settled back to sleep. The creek was audible in the quiet, running full from the spring rains. The mountains to the west held the last light of the sun long after the valley floor had gone into shadow. "Robert," she said. "Yes. Tell me something you haven't told me yet." He considered for a moment, not with resistance but with the honest search for something worth giving. "When I first came to this valley in 1848, he said, "I came around that ridge to the north and looked down at this land for the first time, and I stopped my horse and I sat there for about 10 minutes just looking. Alina was beside me and she didn't say anything either. We just sat there and looked. And then she said, 'This is it. This is the one.' And I knew she was right. That's how I felt about marrying her. And it's how I felt about this land." He looked at the meadow. "And it's how I felt," he said, "when you rode up to my gate." Ida sat with that for a moment, holding the shape of it. "This is it," she said quietly. "This is the one." "Yes," he said, "every morning." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat on the stone porch in the coming dark, while the valley breathed around them, and the stars came out one by one above the cottonwoods, and the east meadow settled into the deep blue quiet of a May evening in 1882, and the life they had built together, which was full and real and rooted in the specific soil of this specific land, rested in the silence between them without any need for further explanation. Years moved through the valley the way years do in country like that, marking themselves in the cycles of the land rather than in the numbers of the calendar. The summer of Thomas's first steps coincided with the summer the creek changed course slightly after a spring flood, eating a new path through the lower pasture, and leaving a small oxbow pond that no one had planned for, and everyone came to love for the way it reflected the sky. The autumn of Clara's first letter of acceptance to the Omaha school coincided with a particularly spectacular fall color season, the aspens so gold they seemed to generate their own light, so that, for about 2 weeks in October, the whole valley appeared to be on fire from a distance. Thomas grew up in the way of children on working ranches, surrounded by the evidence of what sustained life required and how it worked, learning early the connection between effort and outcome, between care given and strength returned. He had his mother's stubbornness and his father's quiet, and a combination of the two that was entirely his own, which tended to produce a person who did not talk very much about what he intended and then simply did it. Robert taught him the land the way he had taught Clara to ride, not by managing the learning but by being present to it, walking with him along fence lines and through pastures and up into the high country, and explaining what he saw and why it mattered. Thomas listened with the complete attention of a child who has learned, from observation of his father, that listening is how you learn to understand things that cannot be explained directly. Clara left for Omaha when she was 15, on a clear October morning that Ida spent being genuinely proud and privately wrecked, which she hid entirely from Clara and shared only with Robert later in the evening when they sat on the porch in the early dark. "She'll be magnificent," he said. "I know," Ida said. "It doesn't make it smaller." "No," he said, "it doesn't." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they sat with the ordinary grief of a good thing moving to its next stage. Clara wrote letters, long detailed ones, full of the new world she was encountering, the school, the other girls, the books she was reading. The teachers who were exacting and brilliant, and who told her flatly, and without softening, that women who intended to practice medicine would face resistance at every step, and that they needed to be twice as prepared as any man in the same room, and that this was unjust and true simultaneously, and the only response was preparation. Clara received this information as confirmation of what she had already understood and kept her notebook of observations and continued. She came home for the summers, and those summers had a particular quality: the convergence of Clara's expanding mind with the ranch life she'd grown up in. Her medical knowledge pressed against the daily realities of animals and weather and human bodies doing the work of the frontier. She set Robert's neighbor's broken arm in the summer of her second year at school, doing it calmly and correctly, while the neighbor's wife looked on with her hands pressed together. And Ida stood nearby being useful, and Robert watched from the doorway with an expression that he probably thought was neutral. "You've done well," he said afterward when the neighbor had gone home with his arm properly set and splinted. "I know how to set a simple fracture," Clara said, with the precision of someone who also knows the difference between what she knows and what she doesn't. "The complex ones are harder. I'm not there yet." "You will be," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I will." He smiled. She was so much her mother's daughter in that absolute, undecorated confidence. The years moved on. Robert was 67 when Thomas was 4. He was 70 when Thomas started school, riding into town every day with the Haverson children, and coming home with the exaggerated exhaustion of a child who has expended his entire personality on the outside world and has nothing left for home. He was 73 when Thomas learned to ride alone across the high pasture, and Robert stood at the fence and watched the boy go, and Ida stood beside him and held his hand. "He rides like you," she said. "He rides like you," he said. "The way you hold the reins, I always knew you learned fast." She looked at him. He was gray now, more fully, the white having taken over entirely in the last few years, and the lines of his face had deepened, but his eyes were the same, clear and direct and fully present. "Are you well?" she asked, because she asked him this regularly, not out of anxiety but out of attention. "Very," he said. "Better than any reasonable man of 73 has a right to claim." "You're unreasonable," she said. "It's one of your better qualities." He laughed. Thomas came back across the high pasture at a full gallop, the horse moving beautifully under him, and Robert watched with the particular satisfaction of a man whose work is yielding exactly what it was meant to yield. Clara finished her medical studies in the spring of 1893 and came home before taking up a position at a clinic in Omaha that served working women and families who could not afford the fees of private physicians. She was 21 years old and a licensed physician, which was still rare enough that people looked at her twice, a thing she had entirely ceased to notice. She came home for 2 weeks before taking up the position, and on the second evening she and Ida sat in the kitchen late while Robert and Thomas were in the barn dealing with a mare who was having a difficult foaling. "Are you afraid?" Ida asked. "No," Clara said. Then, "A little, of getting something wrong." "You will get things wrong," Ida said. "Everyone does, and you'll learn from it and get more things right." Clara looked at her mother across the kitchen table, 21 years old, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's straight back, and something that belonged entirely to herself in the set of her expression. "You're very wise," Clara said. "I'm 40 years old and I've survived some things," Ida said. "That's not wisdom, that's just accumulation." "Seems the same from where I'm sitting," Clara said. They sat together in the warm kitchen while outside in the barn, the mare finally delivered a strong, healthy foal that Thomas would later name Copper and Robert would later describe as the best foal born on the property in 15 years. Clara left for Omaha 3 days later. She would be back. She always came back. But this time she was going as herself, fully. The whole thing she had been becoming since she was 7 years old, sitting in a kitchen, helping a widow figure out how to survive the winter. On the morning she left, Robert stood on the porch and watched her ride away toward town and the stagecoach, and when she had gone from sight he stood there for another moment in the early sun. "She's going to be extraordinary," he said. "She already is," Ida said. "Yes," he said. "I suppose I mean more people are going to find that out." The day came, in the summer of 1894, when Ida found she could no longer easily remember what grief had felt like in that first winter, the particular texture of that specific cold, the way the house had sounded at night when it was empty of Thomas's voice, and full of nothing but Clara's quiet sleeping and the wind pressing against the walls. She could remember the facts of it, the leaking roof, the woodpile, the $40, Gerald Dugan's lawyer's letter. But the feeling of being alone in it had become something distant, like a country she had lived in once and could no longer quite access. Robert was 75. He was slower than he had been, in the way that bodies slow, and he tired in the evenings and rose later than he had in the first years of their marriage. But his mind was what it had always been, clear and organized and capable of finding the practical path through any situation. And his presence in the house and on the land was what it had always been, completely itself, completely here. He had told her in one of their late evening conversations that he intended to die in this house, in this valley, on this land, and that he was entirely at peace with that intention. "Are you frightened of it?" she had asked, meaning death, meaning the end. "No," he said. "I've had a life worth having. I'm not frightened of a thing that's the natural conclusion of a life worth having." "I'll miss you terribly," she said, and she meant it in both the future tense and the present, the preemptive missing that love sometimes involves. "I'll be in the land," he said, "same as a leaner. The land holds what we give it." She thought about this. "I'm not going to leave the valley," she said. "I know you're not," he said. "You take the land with you if you tried." Thomas was 15 in 1894, tall now and growing taller, with Robert's build coming in across his shoulders, and he'd taken to the ranch with the wholehearted commitment of someone who understands that what they're doing matters. He could manage most of the operation himself with the hands, and he had Robert's instinct for the land, or had developed it through absorption, which amounted to the same thing. Rose came with her family every other summer, and the house was periodically wonderful with the noise of grandchildren and Coleman Vance's laugh and Rose's brisk efficiency, and the mingling of the two families that had become one. She brought news from Colorado, from the wider world, from the things that were changing in the territory and the country. The railroad had changed everything. The cities were growing. The frontier was becoming something else, more organized, more crowded, the open range shrinking as more people came and more fences went up. "It'll be different when Thomas is grown," Rose said once, sitting with Ida on the porch in the summer evening while Robert and Coleman talked in the yard and the grandchildren ran in the grass. "The valley, the whole territory, he'll be ranching in a different world than Father built in." "Every generation does," Ida said. Rose looked at her with her father's clear eyes. "You know, when Father wrote to me about you, before I came for that first Christmas, he described you as the most capable person he'd met in years who didn't know it yet." Ida was quiet for a moment. "He said that. He said it was the most interesting kind of person there was. Someone who had everything they needed without having been told." Ida looked out at Robert in the yard, talking with Coleman, his hat pushed back, the white of his hair in the evening light. "He's wrong about the not knowing," she said. "I knew I could survive. I just didn't know yet what surviving was going to look like." "And now?" Rose asked. "Now I know it looks like this," Ida said simply. The summer of 1896, Thomas was 17 and had taken on the primary management of the cattle operation, with the kind of quiet authority that surprised no one who had watched him growing up. Robert was 77 and moved more slowly and tired more easily and was entirely untroubled by either of these facts. He still rode, though not as far as he had. He still walked the fence lines, though he took Thomas with him. He still sat on the stone porch in the evenings and watched the east meadow in the last light, and Ida still sat beside him. One evening in September, a letter arrived from Clara. She had been practicing medicine in Omaha for 3 years, and the letter contained, tucked inside the normal news about her patients and her work, and the particular difficulty of being a woman doctor in a profession still run almost entirely by men, a piece of news that she delivered with characteristic directness. She had met a man. His name was Dr. Arthur Bell. He was a surgeon, and he was kind, and he was interested in her opinions, which she noted was not as common as it should be. And she was writing to say that she intended to invite him to visit the valley in the coming year so that he could meet the family. Ida read this letter twice, and then handed it to Robert without a word. He read it once and handed it back. "Good," he said. "You think so," she said. "A man who is interested in her opinions," he said. "She's a doctor, her opinions are medically excellent. A man who understands that is a man worth meeting." Ida laughed, a full genuine laugh. "She'll want your approval," he said. "She might not say so, but she will." "I know," Ida said. "She'll have it if he deserves it. And if he doesn't, then she'll figure that out herself," Ida said. "She's a doctor. Her judgment is medically excellent." He looked at her, and the smile that crossed his face was slow and warm and completely unguarded, and Ida felt, at 43 years old, sitting on a stone porch in September, the same quickening she had felt in the East Meadow in 1880 when he had crossed the space between them and taken her face in his hands. She chose it every morning. She had been choosing it for 16 years. It had become so natural she did not always notice it. But in moments like this one, she noticed it completely. "Robert," she said. "Yes, I love you." He took her hand. "I know," he said. "I love you too." They sat in the September evening while the East Meadow went from gold to amber to the deep soft blue of dusk, and the first star appeared above the mountains, and the creek ran in the quiet, and the valley held them as it had held them for all these years, as it had held his first coming and her difficult winter, and every season between. Clara came home for Christmas of 1896 with Dr. Arthur Bell, who was 32 years old, and had the look of a man who has realized he is being evaluated and is doing his best to be worthy of it. Robert shook his hand on the porch and looked at him directly and asked him exactly 2 questions. How long had he been a surgeon, and what did he think of Clara's work? Arthur Bell answered both questions without hesitation. 5 years, and that her work was exceptional and that she saw things he missed, which he considered an asset rather than a threat. Robert nodded and let them inside. "Well," Ida asked him later when they were alone. "A man who has been a surgeon for 5 years and describes a colleague's differing perspective as an asset rather than a threat," Robert said, "has thought seriously about what medicine requires. He did do." Clara and Arthur were married the following spring in Omaha, a ceremony that Ida and Robert attended with Thomas, making the journey north, Robert in his best jacket, and Ida in the green dress she'd had made the previous autumn. Clara was radiant and certain and absolutely herself, and Arthur Bell looked at her the way that she deserved to be looked at, with full and undecorated admiration. Standing beside Robert at the ceremony, watching her daughter get married, Ida felt the full arc of what had happened since that gray September morning in 1879, when she had buried Thomas Dugan and stood at the fence line of her property, and did not know how she would survive. She had gone to ask a man about the winter. He had told her about the land and the woodpile and the cattle and the fence lines and the spring water sources. And then on a November afternoon by the creek in the aspens, she had asked him what love felt like, and he had stood up and pointed at 2 horses in a meadow who were choosing to stand close together of their own free will. She had been choosing it every morning since, for 17 years. She reached over and took Robert's hand where it rested at his side. He looked at her. "All right," he said quietly under the minister's words. "All right," she said. "More than." He squeezed her hand, and they stood together watching their daughter begin her life, the one she had been moving toward since she was 7 years old. They went back to the valley at the end of the week. The road home from the stagecoach stop was the same road it had always been, the valley spreading below them as they came over the northern ridge, the creek silver in the late light, the homesteads and ranches arranged in the familiar pattern, the Haverson land to the south, Pete Ockaffer's place by the creek bend, And there, at the end of the Chandler Road, the stone house under its cottonwood trees, smoke already beginning to rise from the kitchen chimney because Thomas had gotten home ahead of them and started the fire. Robert pulled the wagon to a stop at the top of the ridge, the way he sometimes did, looking out. The east meadow was just visible from here, a long sweep of pale grass in the late autumn light, the aspens bare along its far edge, the mountains dark beyond. Ida sat beside him on the wagon seat with the valley below them. 31 years, she said. 47 for me, he said. She thought about that. 47 years of this valley, nearly half a century of this land. Is it what you thought it would be, she said, when you came over that ridge in 1848? He looked at the valley for a long moment. More, he said simply, much more. She leaned against him, her shoulder against his, and he put his arm around her and they stayed there on the ridge for a few minutes in the cold November air, looking down at what they had, what they were, what the years had made of two people who had found each other on the far edge of chance and chosen, every morning, to keep finding each other again. Then he picked up the reins and they went home. The stone house received them. The fire was going and Thomas had started supper, and the smell of it was warm through the kitchen. The cottonwood trees stood steady in the evening wind, as they had stood for 40 years, their roots deep in the soil of this valley. Ida set her bag down and looked around the main room, at the bookshelves and the Navajo blanket, and the table of dark wood worn smooth by so many years of use. Her things were mixed with his things throughout the room, her mending basket by the good chair, her gardening books on the lower shelf. A drawing Clara had made when she was 8 hung on the wall by the window, all of it layered into what had been his life, and was now the life they shared. She stood by the window and looked out at the east meadow in the last light. Robert came and stood beside her. Like that, she said quietly, looking at the meadow. Repeating what he had said to her 16 years ago, in a different season, in a different meadow, which was also this meadow, which had always been this meadow. He looked at her. Exactly like that, he said. Outside, the east meadow held the last gold of the day. The aspen trees at its far edge were bare and silver in the November light. The creek ran cold and clear through the valley floor. The mountains stood against the sky as they had always stood, as they would always stand, certain and dark and indifferent to the small, beautiful lives assembled at their feet. And in the stone house under the cottonwood trees, with supper on the stove and the fire going and the valley all around them, Robert Chandler and Ida Dugan stood at the window together and watched the light go out of the day, and were exactly where they had chosen to be every morning for all the mornings that counted.